Hello, Soul Masters. This is Jeff or Alathos, and we have episode 4, which is resolving a card effect, the stack, and timing bubbles, which are a bunch of topics that are a little nuanced and unfortunately very information heavy. But it is important to know and understand certain other interactions in the game, and I want to talk about it a little bit more into detail. Moving on to the first thing, which is active player, non-active player. Now, for those of you that are familiar with TCGs, this should be a somewhat familiar concept to you. Basically speaking, active player is the player whose turn it is. They receive priority first during most steps and phases. It is the turn player, active player, attacking player in many cases. Essentially, they are the person that is dictating what is going on during that turn. Non-active player is everyone else in turn order that then act after the active player. Now, this is a setup for whenever there is a bunch of multiplayer, but for now, the most part, the non-active player is basically the opponent, the other player, the non-turn player. Active player, non-active player is also used when multiple triggered skills go on the stack. Like a unit getting KO'd, it's useful for when multiple players need to make choices or take actions at the same time. It's basically a way to explain how certain interactions in the game work and be a general rule of thumb that you can utilize. So whenever multiple things go on the stack, you can say active player, non-active player, that's the order. So one of the biggest examples of this is when there are multiple triggers being put on the stack. The active player puts their triggers on the stack, making their choices first to start the stack. The non-active player then puts it in turn order, their triggers on the stack. The stack then resolves last in, first out. The non-active player's skills or effects resolve before the active players. So whenever you're thinking about if there are multiple effects being put on, always think active player, non-active player. That's the order that stuff get put on the stack. And then last in, first out. Non-active player, stuff will start resolving first because it was the last one in, so therefore it is the first one out. That's kind of where those come from. They're really easy to remember and really easy to apply basically as a quick check in your head that gives you pretty much the answer right away. So here's an example of what I mean. Here you have Filbert and Zephyr. Filbert attacks Zephyr. Zephyr's controller is at 1 health. No prevention or effects to stop the KO are occurring, so we're just going to assume that it is just straight up happening. Nothing else is occurring. It's just the KO effects. Filbert KOs Zephyr. Trample and Favored effect go on the stack. So to wrap up, what ends up happening is Filbert, the active player, Trample skill goes on to the stack. And then Zephyr, who's the non-active player's, Favored skill gets added to the stack. Favored resolves first, healing for 2, and now Zephyr's controller is at 3 health. And then the Trample resolves last, dealing 1 damage to Zephyr's controller, who is now at 2 health. The reason this matters is because if it resolved the other way, then the person would, theoretically if they had no cards in hand, die. Priority determines who has the right to act, to cast spells, abilities, use skills, add shield energy, play unit, play reserve, or pass, whenever they're actable. Now, it controls the flow of the interactions between these players and an order in which the stack is built and resolved. It cannot respond during an effect's resolution, so it has to finish resolving after you start letting it resolve. To explain this a little bit more, when the active player does one of the above, it is placed on the stack. Priority is then immediately transferred to the next non-active player turn order. The non-active player can respond with ability speed cards or skills, similar to above. Priority will then pass back to the action player after something is done or they pass. The active player can do the same. If all players pass consecutively, the topmost item on the stack resolves or begins resolving. Once it fully resolves, the process starts again, priority returns to the active player, and you just pass until the stack fully starts resolving over and over. In between the parts of the stack resolving, so if there are 2, top one resolves, then you can go to the next one. You can still add there. However, after each individual item starts resolving, you cannot add. Whenever the stack is empty, if both players pass, typically you end up passing to the next phase or step, depending on what's going on. So here's a visualization of how the flow of the stack works in a flowchart so that you can visualize it. Now, I put on the right the color coding that helps a little bit more for the visualization. White is basically when the stack changes, either forming or being gone. The green is when a player has a choice to make The red is whenever a player is responding to whatever previous choice, and then yellow is whenever they are passing to the previous choice. So we have the start of the stack. Turn player A decides to cast a spell or ability, use a card skill, or passes, and then priority gets passed to player B, who can choose to either pass, and if they do pass and player A wants to respond again, they can, and then it just keeps looping back. If player B does want to respond, they can cast an ability, use a card skill, or otherwise use shield energy if it's relevant for damage. If player A decides to respond to that, we get just a full loop that continues going until both players stop doing stuff. Now, if player A passes to whatever player B just did, and player B decides that they want to do something else, again, the loop just continues until both players stop doing stuff and both players pass. In both of these passing cases, if they choose to pass as well, the other player, then we continue on to resolving the stack. The stack resolves, last in, first out, like we talked about before. Stack begins clearing, and after each part of the stack resolving, you may pass or add to it again. This continues the process over and over and over until you eventually get to the point where the stack fully clears. If you choose to, you can start the stack again. So we're talking a bunch about how the stack works and what goes on in the stack. Let's talk about things that do not go on the stack. These don't go on the stack at all and then resolve immediately. Drawing a card during the draw cycle, declaring attacks because then the triggers will go on to the stack and then proceed after the attack declaration step. Paying for costs, turning a nulled face down unit face up because if you remember Morph in Magic the Gathering, it's basically just it doesn't use a stack, it just changes how it exists. Resting a card from the energy field for energy generation skills, playing a card to the energy field, conjure skills, which resolves immediately when declaring an attack. It's basically the commander gain a resource. Static effects like haste or resist, which are always on, and some state-based actions like a unit getting KO'd from lethal damage without an on-KO trigger. It just goes to discard. And then last but not least, the priority skill, if you remember that from the previous episode. So we're going to briefly talk about the proper resolution of a card. Basically, this is just saying, hey, this is how you make sure that you do it correctly. First, you need to, whenever a card is played, it will need to enter the stack, and you must have a valid target to resolve it. So in the case of, say, abilities that have damage prevention or damage increase, you have to have a target for it, which is why you can't play them anytime, because unless you're attacking or being attacked or being dealt damage, you can't target something for that effect. When a card is added to the stack, the player who played it must pay all the costs to ensure it is properly played. If a card says, discard a card to pay for this cost, nothing happens until you discard that card. So if you don't discard that card, both of you are just going to sit there staring at each other until you discard it, or not play it. Once all costs are paid, the opposing player can play a card in response. They have to follow the same rules, of course. If either player doesn't add to the stack, the top part of the stack will resolve. That's basically when both players decide to pass. All card effects will be triggered once resolved, if any. If one part of the skill or card fails invalid target, other parts still happen if the effect resolves. If it gets counterspelled, sorry, the whole thing is gone. One little interaction that I wanted to point out though is there is effects like Claire, who is a 12th army unit, and there's one in Lamia as well, that add its attack to target commander or unit. Now, when Claire's ability goes on the stack, at the point, the ability does give 3 damage to it and is put onto the stack. The card does not have to be on the field to fully resolve this effect. It is not trying to say current attack of the card that exists on the field, it is just identifying that number and then that effect goes on the stack. It's a little bit different on how it works in other games. If you have a ability speed removal to try to kill it in response to activating the effect, unfortunately it still does gain the attack. So, going on to timing bubbles, which exist to help players understand when a card or skill can be activated. So you have cards like green that are used for trap cards that can be activated while they are face down in your energy field if you meet the conditions on the card. Some cards can only be used in the defender phase, most require it to be readied in the energy field. Purple is for faction abilities, they are just basically a triggered effect. Then you have white, which is used for upkeep triggers to represent a mandatory cost for upkeeping the card in play. If you choose to not pay the cost or can't, the card is sent to the discard, some removed from play. If it's a unit, it does not count as a KO for triggers. Orange with black text are for cards or effects that are restricted to only being usable in the defender step, specific. And then you have orange with white text, which are triggers when you declare an attack. Pink is for on-play abilities, which trigger when the card is played and resolved from a player's hand. Typically, it is also on course to indicate the on-play effect for glitching out a card from the energy field. Blue is for specific timing of cards, so follow the keyword. Main means you can only activate it on your own turn during the main phase. It can be used as an ability speed on your own turn. On cast refers to an effect that triggers when you cast a card. Must be resolved as part of the casting process. If the effect allows you to skip resolution, the card resolves as normal. However, if the effect includes a mandatory condition, it must be fulfilled for the card to resolve successfully. To continue the blues, on KO triggers when a unit is KO'd by combat or card effect that specifically causes a KO to occur. On play, blue battleground triggers when entering the battleground from hand. It does not activate if the card enters play from another zone, deck or discard, unless specified. On play, pink energy field triggers when entering the energy field. It does not activate if the card enters play from another zone, same as before. Once means you may only activate it one time until your next turn, one per turn cycle. This refreshes at the refresh upkeep phase. You cannot stack or activate the same skill multiple times to try to cheat multiple triggers out. An example of this skill specifically would be, for example, healing off your commander with the heal effect where you can discard a resource to heal one, or in Volcania's case, where you can prevent one damage. Well, Soul Masters, I hope that you enjoyed and you are accurately able to understand the stack, priority, and timing bubbles so that you'll be able to take advantage of certain interactions and level up your play. The next one is going to be on combat, so get ready for that one. As always, there's tons of information still in the description for the rules book as well as all these slideshows so that you can use them however you would like. So make sure to look out for the next video.